Today, it's almost a year ago that the GDPR was implemented. And I've seen quite some strange information regarding the GDPR. I saw people that had green dots on their heads, otherwise they can be photographed. Or with that green dots on their head, they might not be photographed. But I've seen quite some strange information about the GDPR. But now that the dust has been settled, we're trying to take a look at the GDPR 1 year later. What happens in regards to the test data management and GDPR in general? Let me first of all do a quick introduction of DATPROF. DATPROF is a software vendor based in the Netherlands and have several customers throughout the world and helping them out with the test data management challenges they face. And we have several software products in the different areas of test data management in general. And we have DATPROF Privacy, which helps you out with the data masking solution. DATPROF Subset, who helps you out with creating small extracts out of a production database. DATPROF Runtimes, which helps you out with provisioning the test data at the right time, at the right moment, in your right environment. And with DATPROF Analyze, we are able to make statistics and have some data discovery on your data sources. So that's about DATPROF in general. Just a small recap. The GDPR was implemented like more than a year ago in 2018. And since then, there were a lot of discussions. And just to make a small recap of it all, there are some things written down over here. But in general, you might say that the GDPR is replacing the old legislation that we had concerning the privacy of 1995. That was a European privacy regulation. But like in 1995, we didn't have Facebook, for example, or we didn't have Twitter. So with these new social media, but also the complexity of our current IT systems, the European Commission thought it would be very wise to make sure that there's a new data protection regulation that's more up to date to the current IT systems and the current world. And I think that's great. And that's something that we should be proud of, and it's something that should be done, because in the end, privacy is a right that everybody has. So in general, these are really explicit. These are in short recap, especially the consent. You saw over the year a lot of people asking for explicit consent to make sure that they could use their email addresses or they could use their data for all kinds of purposes. Also, the breach notification has been heard of quite often, but these are the main topics that you saw quite sometimes when there were some discussions about GDPR. In the preparation of this webinar, I was starting to search on the internet and make some research, and I really thought, what are some nice statistics that could be told about the GDPR? And of course, the fines are pretty interesting, which is already showed in this slide. But next to that, there are also some other important things that should be noticed. For example, the awareness. It isn't shown in this slide, but like in the 76%, 67% of all the European people living in Europe have heard of the GDPR, which is quite a high number, as I may believe. So that's pretty okay. There were more than 150,000 complaints to the data protection authorities about data privacy problems, and so they complained in like 140,000 times at the data protection authority. In total, there were like a little bit less than 90,000 data breach notifications, and the most important ones are telemarketing. So there were a lot of breach notifications concerning telemarketing, email campaigns, but also CCTV, for example. What's also interesting is the GDPR is not only concerning the European citizens, civilians, they're also concerning like all of the companies that working with European customers, but in total there were like 450 cross-border cases in the last year. And what's also pretty interesting, of course, is there were like in total this is 56 million euro worth of fines have been executed due to the GDPR. There's also a nice infographic available. It's from the European Commission. We also shared it on our LinkedIn profile of DATPROF. So if you might be interested, go to our LinkedIn profile and you can see this GDPR number. This was on the birthday of the GDPR, and it's always saying that there's on the awareness phase, there's the compliancy with the rules, and there's enforcing the rules. And there are also the number of cross-border cases and the number of fines that has been given with the data protection authorities. But these are just numbers, and numbers should tell a story. So just to be a little bit more precise about the fines and the highest fines of the GDPR per country, which is interesting. In the Netherlands, the highest fine is 600,000 euros in total. Not in total, that was only the highest fine, but in France, there is like a 50 million euros worth of fines in France. So that maybe the Data Protection Authority was quite aggressive. They are, but it's not like in number, but this is only one fine. So in France, Google was fined with the help of the GDPR of a total number of 50 million euros. So in the total, there was like 56 million euros worth of fines, but in total, there was one fine of 50 million euros. That was France. So all the other fines were way less than what France did with Google. But still, if you take a look at the number of fines, I see a lot of fines that are around 400,000 euros or more. And some of them are a little bit less than 100,000, and there's Denmark in the middle. So in general, you might say that still these numbers are pretty high, and there are quite more than the opportunity was with the help of the old legislation out of 1995. What's also interesting, just to show you the number of complaints that per country, there are maybe more statistics available, but these are some of the statistics I found during my research. What's interesting, there are quite a lot of complaints in the United Kingdom and in Germany and in the Netherlands, compared to some other ones. Also in France, there is quite a large number, but really compared to the number of citizens that in the Netherlands, they're pretty good at complaining, which I do agree because I know some Dutch people. But also in Germany and the United Kingdom, there are quite a lot of complaints made to the Data Protection Authority. And if you look at data breach notification per country, the Netherlands is topping the sheet because there are in total 12,000 breach notifications in the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom and Germany is running behind the Netherlands in this case. So, in general, you might say after a year of GDPR and the GDPR in general, that you also see some differences. If I read some articles on the World Wide Web, you find some articles that some data protection authorities are still in the informing phase. So even while the GDPR is in place and it's implemented, still some data protection authority aren't really fining organizations because they're still informing. They have the need to inform the organizations at first. But I think this will be ending quite soon, and they are fining people just to make sure that there will be compliance to the rules and the regulations we have nowadays. In the Netherlands, the breach notifications, maybe it's different, because already at the beginning of 2018, a year before the GDPR was in place, they already had a new legislation in place that concerns also breach notifications. So that might be a reason why the number of breach notifications in the Netherlands is twice the size of what happens in the United Kingdom or in Germany. When we take a look at the test data management and test data, when we think about the GDPR, we see some trends, and one of the important trends is like the importance of security. Information security is noticed. We see that there's a real talk about synthetic test data versus masked test data. We've seen some development in the maturity of test data. There's some discussion about subsetting to mitigate some risks and the entry of new parties. I will talk you through all of these different agenda points, and then we will be through this webinar. So let me start with the first one. The importance of information security is noticed. In general, I think information security was also important, but it was also sometimes a little bit more like window dressing, as I believe. There wasn't like enough budget, enough money available to really make information security important. With the help of the GDPR, you really see that there's that information security is getting important, and it's more important than we ever had before. So I've saw quite some applications that try to ask me, we need a two-way authentication. So I needed to add also any other information to make sure that they knew that if I go to an application that I was able with two-way security, that I'm really the person sitting next to the laptop or sitting next to the desktop to make sure that you logged in. You also saw there's quite a lot of attention towards the privacy by design or the privacy by default. So these themes were really seen in the last year when we think about information security. And that's pretty important, because I really do think that maybe we neglected the information security over the last couple of years. And with the help of GDPR, there's quite a lot of attention towards information security. But what's still happening, there's quite still some attention towards the production system in general. There are many cases people and information DPOs, data protection officers, are looking at the production environment themselves and trying to make sure that these are as secure as possible. But what we also do think is, and that's need to be a little bit more noticed also over the couple of months and years, is that for every production systems, there are multiple copies of production in non-production environments. And this is something information security should still be noticing a little bit more, and they really need to make sure that they know that this is happening. So for every production system, there will be at least three other, in many cases, at least three other environments: an acceptance environment, a QA environment, and a dev environment. Maybe only a QA and an acceptance, but in many cases, you see multiple copies of production in non-production environments, which is something we did in the history, and what we still did in the past, and what we're still doing at the current state, but we really need to change it. We really need to do something about it, and we should be aware that these things are happening, and that there's something that you should mitigate and you should be aware of, especially because these are full-size copies, or because the two-way authentication on non-production environments are not needed, or are slowing you down, or especially because the last security patches hasn't been run on this non-production environment. So it's getting critical that we make sure that everybody is aware of the fact that for every system you have in production, you will have at least 1, 2, or 3 copies of production in your non-production environment, which has a lower security level. But this is happening, and also with the help of the GDPR, there's some more attention to these environments. Another important thing we noticed in the last couple of months, over the last year, we see there's a lot of attention towards synthetic test data. And it's in many cases compared towards masking or anonymizing or pseudonymizing production data. synthetic test data is quite interesting. I really do think so, because when you really have synthetic test data available, and if you really synthetically generate the test data from scratch, the test data is really anonymized or masked, or it doesn't really exist. It's 100% non-existing test data that you have. And with data masking, there's a bit of a downside, because with the masking part, it can still be happening that a individual can be recognized based upon the masked test data. But in the end, there's another need, and because we are all in the business of software quality, we want to make sure that software is going to production with the right quality. And to make sure this will happen, we need to have test data which is representative based upon the production data. And if this isn't representative, we're not able to do our job in a proper way. So there are two demands, two requirements in this test data area. We see in many cases that production systems, your core systems, which are in many cases built upon Oracle, SQL Server, DB2, these systems are pretty complex, and these aren't systems with only 100 tables. There are many cases systems with multiple tables. They contain like history information. They contain migrated data. They contain all sorts of data quality issues. So this is getting quite difficult, especially if you want to synthetically generate test data for all of these test cases. And because we're in the business of software quality, we want to make sure that our test data set is representative for going to production. So generate synthetic test data for all of the different tables or data model for the data model itself is quite time consuming. And this is something that we should be aware of. And we really do think that synthetic test data is nice because of the fact that it's really GDPR compliant. But we also believe that with the help of masking and synthetically generate, that you're also GDPR compliant. This can be done. That's some of our customers have already done it. And the perfect part of that part is that you really can make sure that based upon the test data, you can go to production with the right amount of software quality, and you have the right software quality level. You can make sure, and you can show it in your test reports, that with the right software quality, you could go to production. And this is right now still not possible with synthetic test data and generate it for all. Because if you had like a system for maybe 1,000 tables with 10 columns in each table, you already need to generate synthetic test data for like 10,000 times. So that's pretty time consuming, and that's only one system. So in the end, synthetic test data, it's nice, and I see it happening in quite some requests for proposals or requests for information, but it really comes from the information security officer. But there should be a real balance between the requirements for the security level, but also the requirements of the software quality and the software development level. What we also see is a little bit the maturity of the data masking itself, data masking tools. So in the beginning, I think some of the data masking solutions weren't as mature as nowadays. We see that that right now there's a real need or a requirement for really complex data masking rules. And I think every data masking solution is able to shuffle some data or scramble some data. But nowadays, data masking tools should be able to make data masking rules more complex than we did before. So it should be easy to make really complex data masking solutions. So just to give you a little bit of an example, I showed you right now that we have an HR system with test data inside of it. It's some of my colleagues, and you see my name, and I'm a facility guy, and we've got a director, and we've got a developer. And in many cases, we see that a shuffle, that's not such a big issue. Some of the tools that you right now see are able to shuffle. And of course, in many cases, they are able to scramble. But these are really easy tasks that you ask from a data masking tool. Right now, you see some tools that are also able to make, for example, do something with the salary to make sure that they're based upon the average, because based upon this information, real simple, I might consider that this guy is earning the most money out of all of these three people. So probably this is the director, and this is somebody else, and this is somebody else. So if I really want to make sure that based upon this test data, I can't recognize or relate this information to a real individual person, I should be doing also something with salary. So these kinds of masking rules is getting more and more important, and the complexity is getting more and more important. This isn't even really complex one, because based upon business rules, it's getting even more complex. So, but nowadays you see that some of the tools are able to synthetically generate new social security numbers. These are new social security numbers. They're not valid in the Netherlands because it needs to be 11 proof. But sometimes for other states or countries, these are available. And with the help of salary, you're also seeing some of the tools are able that they can make salary a little bit higher or lower, and that's based upon the average that has been shown based upon the values that are in a system itself. But it's getting even more interesting if there are some business rules. So based upon a postal area and a policy, a insurance policy should be calculated. These are getting more interesting. But we see that based upon some of the tools that we see right now, that data masking software solutions that are really focused on data masking itself is getting more and more mature, and it's making you easier to adapt to new situations, new compliance reasons, new legislations. So these companies make sure that you're on the right software at the right time. What's also interesting, and that's also what you're seeing right now with the help of synthetic test data, combining multiple techniques will help you in making sure that your test cases or your test data is perfectly aligned to each other. So with the help of synthetic test data, you're able to perfectly align test cases to your test data, which helps you in your test and your and showing everybody that the software is of the right quality or isn't. What we also see nowadays, and it's a little bit different than before, because in many cases we're still using 100% copy of a production database. And that's perfect. But in some cases, production systems could be like millions of people could be available in a production system. And if you make full-size copies of these production systems, you also have millions of people available in a non-production environment, which also, if you have a data leakage, there could be millions of people, their personal data could be on the streets, and it could be sold, whatever it may be. So nowadays we also see that with the help of subsetting, customers are trying to extract small pieces out of a production system and put it in a QA environment, for example, or a marketing environment. So they're not so eager anymore that every team or every marketing team or every software quality team has like a full-size copy. Because there's also, with the help of the GDPR, if this data is leaked, you should also notify all of the people that may concern the data leak have received information that their data was really leaked. So instead of sending millions of emails or millions of letters to these different customers, you have a selected small piece of people that you should be notifying. You probably should mask and synthetically generate test data instead, so it can't be related anymore. But if you didn't done this before, then it's in the end a small number of people that you should be notifying if something went wrong. And the last trend we see in the test data management area is that the new entries, new party entry the market. So right now we see quite a different market. You have new open source solutions, and you also got the new paid or closed source solutions in the market. In the end, there's no real right or wrong in this area. For the open source, I think you should notice the fact that open source is quite interesting. But you really need a community that's working on this this data masking solution. If it's not, it's getting maybe a little bit more troublesome, because what happens if there is a new legislation or there's a change in the GDPR, then the community should solve this question. Otherwise, you need to do it yourself. So there's a little bit of a downside on that part. The closed stores are pretty nice, but maybe a little bit expensive, at least more expensive. But in the other hand, if they're like fines for 400,000 euros, you can pay quite a lot of software solutions, and the return on investment is pretty okay in that case. So, if I may conclude this webinar, we've seen quite a lot of pressure, quite a lot of attention to the GDPR in the last year. It's also helped the test data management challenge to be more upcoming, and there's a lot of discussions about the test data management, especially the test data masking. We've seen that synthetic test data is interesting, but also we saw that especially some test data management gurus know that's pretty complex to synthetically generate test data for complete systems. So I think it will be some time before we really have a full-blown solution for synthetically generated test data for complete core systems with the right representative level to make sure that you can go to production with your software. I think in the coming months, some data protection authorities aren't that nice for new data breaches anymore. The informing phase is a little bit over, and I think there will be more fines to be given in a couple of months or a year. And I think especially the synthetic test data, that's something that we as DATPROF are looking at. We're trying to make sure that we're also having a great synthetic test data generator available, but we will right now position it next to data masking, but we're working on a way of making sure that test data can be generated from scratch for complete systems. But that's a pretty complex task.